Dr. EJ Antoni, economist at the Heritage Foundation and the in-house economist of the Vince Coglianese Show. EJ, good to talk to you today, sir.
Vince, likewise, always a pleasure.
Okay, so we do see a bunch of headlines today that say, hey, the economy's doing pretty good. That's not really the truth, is it? What's happening here?
No, it's not, and you can certainly survey Americans to find out that that's not the case, or you can just actually do a dive into the numbers beyond the headlines and find out that all of the talking heads on TV are once again wrong.
Yes.
I mean, it's absolutely amazing when we talk about this low unemployment rate and we ignore all the millions of people missing from the labor force that are giving us such a low number. But that's just one example of the situation we're at today.
Let me pause on that for a moment, because I think that's a huge piece. And there's some elements here I've been following. You should follow EJ Antoni on Twitter. He's got or X they call it now. He has a bunch of charts and information today helping me to understand all of this. But one thing that really leaps off the page at me is when they say, well, the unemployment rate is unchanged. Well, that doesn't really capture the fact that the labor force is shrinking, meaning we have fewer people even in the labor force, and they say, well, unemployment is unchanged? How does that work?
Well, we have to remember that things like the unemployment rate, these are ratios. So you're looking at you're looking at the number of people who are unemployed and the number of people who are actually in the labor force. Well, the labor force just dropped almost 680,000 in the month of December. And
in a single month?
If you look at a chart of that, exactly, in a single month. And if you look at a chart, you can see we are clearly well below the pre-pandemic trend. So the labor force has never really recovered. In fact, we're missing millions of workers. And there's a few different ways you can calculate it to say, okay, where should we be? But we're basically missing somewhere between, I don't know, 6 or 7 million people from the labor force. So at the end of the day, you actually have, when you do an honest dive into these numbers, you actually have between about 11 and 13 million people today who are unemployed. Now, that's much bigger than the official number, but it takes into account all of the millions of people who have never returned to the labor force after COVID.
When you say 6 to 7 million people are missing, does that mean that aliens do exist, that they were abducted? Where did they go?
Well, so here's something that's really interesting. We have seen a big spike in disability. So that means that you're effectively taking people out of the workforce and putting them on welfare. And I've seen a couple of empirical studies that tried to explain that big jump in disability. One seems to indicate that it has to do with symptoms from long COVID. Another seems to indicate that it has to do with symptoms from the COVID shots themselves. But one thing is that it's very difficult to find control groups in these studies because there are so many people who have had both. They've both had COVID and then got the shot. So it's difficult to say what is the cause of what effect. But whatever the case, you do have that big spike in disability, and then you also have a few other factors as well, including this administration's expansion of welfare programs, which make it easier to be on the government dole and not have to work.
Okay, then let's talk about the government for a moment. To the extent that we say, there were jobs added, non-farm payroll jobs added, 216,000 in December. Another element that stands out to me is what percentage of that was government jobs? Like we're making, in fact, we're not really creating jobs. It seems like the government is paying people and then we're calling that job creation.
Right. Yeah, this is where you really start to see how much of the quote unquote economic growth we see right now, Vinny, is just fueled by the massive federal deficit. So the government jobs directly counted for about a quarter of the job gains that we had last month. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. The first of which is that you need a lot of private sector jobs so that you can get tax revenue from each of them to support a single government job. And when you have about a 3-to-1 ratio, that's not enough tax revenue coming in to maintain that kind of labor force, or that kind of job growth, I should say. But if you want to look at the whole year, it's not just that government is adding jobs, but you also have government-sponsored industries where government is paying a lot of the bills. Think of healthcare, for example. That was the biggest single sector for job growth in 2023. Government was number 2, though. So the number 1 and number 2 categories are both ones that come either directly or indirectly from government checks. And then, of course, number 3, not far behind, was leisure and hospitality. But most of those jobs, unfortunately, are low paying. They're not very good, what we would consider good quality blue collar jobs.
So this is a scam. This is a house of cards. I mean, that's not a real economy. If the government is creating like a disproportionate number of the so-called jobs here, that is a sign of an unhealthy economy, isn't it?
Exactly. And, again, we see this borne out when we start looking at the GDP data. And what we find there is that the increase in the deficit from the previous quarter was almost exactly equal to the increase in economic growth. And so it's not just a matter of government cutting a check directly, but indirectly as well. So a lot of people who are working in healthcare, for example, are indirectly getting paid by the government. But when they go out and spend their money, that's not getting counted in the government category as part of GDP. It's getting counted as part of the private economy.
Okay, now let me talk about full-time jobs with you. There's the number 216,000 jobs. That's the one that the headline number today, in December. 216,000 jobs added. That's not full-time jobs, is it? Or at least a portion of it is not.
No, it's not. So that establishment survey that shows that big 200,000+ increase in jobs, that's different from the household survey where we get a breakdown of what kinds of jobs we're looking at, whether we're looking at full-time or part-time jobs. Full-time jobs in the household survey absolutely collapsed last month. They fell by more than 1.5 million in a single month.
I'm sorry, they fell. The full-time jobs went down last month, 1.5 million?
Exactly. I mean, that's just falling off a cliff. That's the biggest collapse since COVID, when the government shut everyone down and said it's illegal for you to go to work. So this is a pretty big deal. And for some reason, everyone's ignoring it. So all of the job gains that we got were all part-time jobs. And a lot of that is people getting a second or even a third job because they can't make ends meet right now.
Okay, just so, again, so I can understand. This is most of our conversations that consist of this. Like, help me understand this. So if we lost 1.5 million full-time jobs last month, does that mean all of or nearly all of the job so-called gains were part-time? Like, in other words, did we pick up 1.8 million part-time jobs last month? Is that what happened?
So according to the household survey, again, that establishment survey is where we get that increase of over 200,000. The household survey showed a big drop of 600,000 jobs. So the household survey shows we lost 1.5 million full-time jobs, and we only gained about 760,000 part-time jobs. Huh. So again, they're different surveys, and it's not uncommon that one will go up and the other down in a single month. But what's weird is that ever since March of 2022, these two surveys have diverged in a completely unprecedented way. And so there is now this huge gap where the establishment survey shows we continue adding jobs, and the household survey has all but flatlined. In fact, the household survey shows that we added almost no jobs at all for the entirety of 2023.
Wow. Okay, so then the other piece here is that when we see data that tells us about part-time jobs, in the past, you have told me that what that means in this era oftentimes is people who are taking second jobs, that this is actually the same worker counted multiple times. Is that still true in this data in December?
Right, that's exactly right. And and again, that double counting of people went for additional payrolls, the same person but working multiple jobs, so it counts as multiple payrolls. That's at a record high today of 8.6 million. And something important to point out is that when we conduct small surveys of the American people, we see a large number of them working a third job, not just a second, but a third. Well, this statistic doesn't even capture those third jobs, because as soon as I get a second job, I'm moved over into the multiple job holder category. If I go and get a third job, the data will report the exact same number of multiple job holders. And so the situation is likely much worse than this 8.6 million in terms of that double counting.
The fact that the unemployment number came back flat this month, typically what ends up happening is Wall Street sees that as a negative signal, and this is like one of the perverse elements here. That if unemployment improves for the American people, that means that the Fed is going to either raise or hold interest rates at a high level. Is that right? How should we view the way the Federal Reserve is handling interest rates right now?
Well, you're right. The market is very much stuck in good news is bad news mode. And so they want low interest rates because it makes borrowing cheaper and it's going to buoy stock prices.
Right.
In terms of the Fed, though, how they're looking at the data, I mean, I'm sorry, but I think we have to put to bed this notion that the Fed is data dependent and is politically independent. They're simply not. We have routinely seen throughout the last couple of years when the data says one thing, explicitly is telling the Fed, you should do X, and instead they do Y. So unfortunately, I think they are far more, they look far more at which way the political winds are blowing than which way the economic data is pointing.
Okay, then that leads to the next question I have, which is how likely is it that the Fed will meddle in the election, not for the benefit of the American economy, but for the benefit of Joe Biden's reelection?
Well, I mean, if past performance is an indicator of future success, look at what Jerome Powell did when his own political future was on the line. When he was up for renomination and inflation was running up to 40-year highs, he kept interest rates below 1% and said a 75 basis point hike was off the table. But what happened right after he was confirmed by the Senate? He delivered 4 of those 75 basis point hikes in a row and raised rates at the fastest pace in decades. So again, the idea that somehow we have angels in charge of these institutions who are not subject to political incentives, I think is just silly.
Yeah, that gives us a good indication of the way they handle business over there at the Federal Reserve. All right, thank you, EJ Antoni, a student of all of this and really helpful when it comes to sorting through all of this data. Thank you so much, EJ Antoni.